Alara Vos had learned, over 22 years of living in her sister's shadow, that the safest place in any room was the wall. Walls did not expect you to shift into a wolf on command. Walls did not whisper. Tonight, the wall behind her was cold marble veined with gold, and she pressed her spine against it as if it might absorb her entirely into the stone of Ashgrave Hall. The great hall itself seemed built to remind lesser wolves exactly how small they were. Vaulted ceilings rose 3 stories into shadow, hung with iron chandeliers dripping candlelight onto 400 upturned faces. The air smelled of beeswax and crushed lily, and beneath it, the particular musk of a room crowded with shifters trying very hard to behave like courtiers instead of wolves. A low, restless hum of bodies straining against centuries of taught civility. Somewhere above the orchestra's strings, Alara could hear the faint creak of old timber settling, as though even the building itself were holding its breath for what the night might bring. The sable ball came only once in a generation, the night the unmated king of the Aurelian court walked among the daughters of the lesser packs to choose a mate by scent alone, guided by whatever ancient magic ran in alpha blood. Every pack within 300 miles had sent its unmarried omegas, dressed in silver and midnight blue, the traditional colors of offering. Girls Alara had grown up hearing about only in gossip, the willowy twin daughters of the Harrow pack, the fierce-eyed heiress of Clandune, a dozen others whose names blurred into a glittering, anxious crowd, stood clustered near the dais in postures that had clearly been rehearsed for weeks. Alara wore the same silver as the others, though her gown had been remade twice from her mother's old wardrobe, the seams restitched by her own hands in the dark of her room, so no one would see her fumbling with a needle like a human. She had pricked her fingers twice doing it, and hidden the small marks under long gloves, because a Vos daughter bleeding over her own dress was one more small humiliation nobody needed to witness. She thought, not for the first time, of the years before this one. The summer she'd turned 13, and every other girl in the pack had come home from the woods laughing and half-dressed and radiant with the shock of a first shift, while Alara sat on the porch steps waiting for a change that never came. She remembered her father's face that autumn, carefully arranged into something between disappointment and pity, and the pack healer's cold fingers pressing along her ribs afterward, murmuring about dormant bloodlines in a voice that never once sounded surprised. She had spent 9 years since then constructing a life around an absence, learning needlework instead of running the family's hunting lands, keeping ledgers instead of keeping pace with a wolf she didn't have, becoming, by careful practiced necessity, the useful, quiet daughter instead of the celebrated one. She could not shift. She had not shifted once in her life, not at 13 when her wolf was supposed to wake, not at 16 when the pack healer pressed cold hands to her ribs and murmured about dormant lines, not at 20 when her father stopped mentioning it at all, as though silence might erase the shame of it. In a world built on the wolf beneath the skin, Alara Vos was, by every measure that mattered, only half a person. "Stand up straight," her sister Seraphine hissed, sweeping past her in a gown the color of a moonless sky, diamonds strung through hair so pale it looked spun from starlight. "You're an embarrassment even leaning against a wall." Seraphine was everything Alara was not, golden-eyed, quick-shifting, adored. She had been the pride of the Vos Pack since the day her wolf first broke free of her small body at 11 years old, a shimmering gray shape that had run 3 full circuits of the training yard while their father wept openly with pride. Alara had watched that same memory get retold at every gathering since, polished a little brighter each time, until it had become less a memory than a kind of scripture the whole pack recited about what a proper Vos daughter looked like. Seraphine had never been cruel by nature exactly. Alara could remember faintly, a childhood before the distance, small kindnesses now buried under years of practiced disdain. But she had been raised to believe her sister's failure to shift was a moral defect rather than a mystery, and she had absorbed that belief the way children absorb any lesson repeated often enough by someone they love. Their father, Lord Bastian Vos, had built his entire remaining fortune on the wager that Seraphine would catch the king's eye tonight and drag the failing Vos Pack back into royal favor. The Vos lands had been bleeding money for a decade. Poor harvests, a disastrous investment in a northern timber venture, 2 seasons of tribute paid late to the crown, and a royal mate bond was, in the cold calculus of pack politics, worth more than any trade agreement Bastion could otherwise hope to broker. He had spent 3 months securing this gown for Seraphine alone, had drilled her on court etiquette every evening after supper, had reminded her at breakfast that morning that the whole family's future rode on tonight's outcome, as though she needed reminding of a weight she'd been carrying her entire adult life. Alara had been brought only because tradition required every eligible daughter of age to attend the sable ball, and because leaving her behind might have raised questions no one wanted asked, the kind of questions that had trailed Alara her whole life, and that her father had spent considerable effort ensuring never quite got answered. The great doors opened. Silence fell over 400 wolves like a dropped veil. King Ronan Ashgrave entered alone, as Alpha Kings always did, dressed in black that made no attempt at ornament, because he needed none. He was tall in the way old stone towers were tall, built to outlast weather, not to charm it. His eyes were the deep amber of banked fire, and when they swept the ballroom, every Omega present felt the pull of it. That ancient current that ran beneath all wolf-kind, calling wordlessly, "Is it you?" The musicians in the gallery above had shifted, without anyone announcing it, from the formal opening waltz to something slower and more expectant, strings drawn thin and taut, the way a room holds its breath before a storm breaks. Alara had attended enough smaller gatherings over the years to recognize the particular choreography of a sable ball from the stories alone, how the Omegas would be arranged loosely by pack rank near the center of the floor, how the king's circuit of the room was meant to look unhurried, even though every soul present understood exactly what was being decided in real time. How the entire evening existed to compress 2 centuries of tradition into a single walk across polished stone. Alara had heard the stories, that the king's mate sense was so refined he could catalog a scent from across a battlefield, that he had rejected 3 formal courtships already this year, because none of them had struck the resonance the old bonds required, sending home 3 furious, humiliated lords whose daughters had been paraded before him with the same confidence Seraphine wore tonight. That he had fought at the Kelmore border himself 2 winters past, rather than send his betas in his place, and that the scar along his left forearm, visible now beneath his rolled sleeve, had come from a blade meant for one of his own soldiers. That he was, beneath the crown, desperately, quietly lonely, though no one said that part above a whisper, because kings were not supposed to be lonely, only chosen. He moved through the room the way water moves through a narrow channel, unhurried, but utterly unstoppable, and every wolf he passed seemed to lean instinctively out of his path without quite deciding to. Alara watched him pause before the Harrow twins, his expression polite and entirely unmoved. Watched him incline his head to Clan Dune's fierce-eyed heiress with the same careful, empty courtesy. He was, she realized, doing exactly what the old stories said an Alpha King did at the Sable Ball, testing the room, waiting for the pull that would tell him where to stop. She had assumed, without ever quite deciding to assume it, that it would not be for her. She had assumed that for so long it had stopped feeling like an assumption and started feeling like a fact of the world, the same fact as gravity, or winter. Seraphine stepped forward the moment the king's gaze reached their side of the hall, chin lifted, golden eyes catching the chandelier light exactly as she had practiced in the mirror for a month. Alara watched her sister bloom into her best self, the way she always did when an audience was watching, and felt the old familiar ache, not quite jealousy, something sadder and more tired than that. The king's eyes passed over Seraphine. They stopped on Alara. For 3 full seconds, Ronan Ashgrave went utterly still, the way a wolf goes still before it understands it has found something it has hunted for, without knowing the hunt had a name. Then he began walking, not toward the glittering cluster of Omegas at the center of the room, not toward Seraphine's outstretched, waiting hand, but along the edge of the hall, past 6 other packs, past a duke's daughter who visibly gasped, straight toward the wall where the Vos family's disappointment stood trying to disappear into gold-veined marble. Whispers rose like a struck hive. Seraphine laughed, high, bright, cruel, pitched perfectly to Carrie. "Oh, he's only stretching his legs," she said to the cluster of omegas around her, loud enough for the nearest dozen wolves to hear. "Nobody wants you, Alara. Not even a king could want a girl with no wolf at all. He's probably lost, or he pities you." The laughter around her sister rippled outward, uncertain, cruel by proximity. The king did not stop walking. He crossed the last 10 feet of marble floor and stopped directly before Alara, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him, could smell. For the first time in her life, though she had no wolf to name it with, something that struck her chest like a struck bell. Cedar and rain and the deep mineral scent of old stone after a storm. Her human eyes stung without her understanding why. The Alpha King of the Aurelian court knelt. In front of 400 witnesses, in front of her father's stricken face and her sister's frozen, disbelieving smile, Ronan Ashgrave went down on one knee before the daughter everyone called broken and took her trembling hand in both of his. "There you are," he said, quiet enough that it should have been private, and yet the whole hall heard it, because the whole hall had gone silent enough to hear a candle gutter. "I have been looking for you for 11 years. Alara stared down at him, her mind a white roar of static. "I don't understand," she whispered. "I have no wolf. I can't be your mate. I can't be anyone's." Something moved behind the king's amber eyes, grief, old and carefully banked, like a fire kept burning under ash for a very long time. "You have a wolf," he said. "Someone bound her. And I think," he added, low enough that only she could hear it, his thumb brushing once over the inside of her wrist, over a faint silver scar she had carried since infancy, and never once questioned. "I think I know who." A murmur swept the hall behind them, rising and falling like wind through wheat. 400 wolves trying to reconcile what their eyes were showing them with everything they had been taught about the Vos family's broken daughter. Somewhere near the dais, one of the Harrow twins whispered something to the other behind a gloved hand. Near the musicians' gallery, an elderly lord Alara didn't recognize was already leaning toward his neighbor, eyes bright with the particular hunger of a man who scented the beginning of a scandal worth retelling for years. Alara's whole body had gone strangely light, as if the floor beneath her had thinned to something less solid than marble. Every instinct told her this could not be real, that some cruel trick was underway, that Seraphine's mockery moments ago had been the truth, and this was only its punishing inverse, a king's pity dressed up as a miracle so the fall afterward would hurt worse. And yet his hands around hers were solid and warm, and entirely unhurried, and his eyes, when she made herself meet them, held nothing that looked like pity at all. Behind them, Lord Bastian Vos had gone the color of old parchment, one hand gripping the back of a chair as though the room had tilted under him too. Seraphine's laughter had died in her throat, replaced by something Alara had never once seen on her sister's face in 22 years. Uncertainty, raw and unrehearsed, entirely unsuited to the golden, effortless mask Seraphine had worn since childhood. "Rise, my Lord King," the Master of Ceremonies said at last, his voice cracking slightly on the ancient formal address, clearly unprepared for a sable ball that had unfolded nothing like the last 3 generations of them. The court awaits your word." Ronan rose, but he did not release Alara's hand. "My word," he said, loud enough now for every corner of the hall to hear, "is that I have found what 11 years of searching could not name, and I do not intend to explain myself to anyone in this room before I understand it myself." His eyes flicked once, briefly, to Lord Bastian Vos, and something in that glance made Alara's stomach drop even before she understood why. Lord Vos. I believe you and I have a great deal to discuss. Privately. The great doors of Ashgrave Hall stood open behind the king, the night beyond them full of a rising wind that smelled faintly of a storm no one else in the room could feel coming. The king's private study occupied the east tower of Ashgrave Hall, a round room lined floor to ceiling with books older than most of the packs in the kingdom. Firelight caught on gilt spines and the brass fittings of a great map table strewn with parchment, trade routes, treaty boundaries, a half-finished letter in a hand too precise to be anyone's but the king's own. The room smelled of old paper and wood smoke and, faintly, of the same cedar and rain scent Alara had caught in the ballroom, as though it had soaked into the very walls of the space he kept for himself. Alara sat stiffly in a leather chair too fine for anything she'd owned, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from shaking, while Ronan paced before the hearth like a man working through a puzzle whose pieces did not want to fit. She had expected, on some buried level, that once the doors closed and the audience vanished, the strange fever of the ballroom would break, that he would look at her plainly, in private light, and see what everyone else saw. A lesser daughter with no wolf and no fortune, and no reason at all to interest a king. Instead, he had simply guided her up 3 flights of stairs with a hand steady at the small of her back, murmured an order to a startled steward for tea. Neither of them would drink, and begun, the moment the door shut, treating her exactly as he had in the hall, as a fact newly confirmed, rather than a mystery to be politely disposed of. 11 years ago, he said, the Aurelian court sent envoys to negotiate a border treaty with the Vos Pack lands. I was 17, not yet crowned. My father brought me along to observe. He stopped, staring into the fire. There was a child there, an infant actually, barely walking. I remember my wolf reacting to her the way it had never reacted to anything. Not before, not since. My father laughed it off as a pup's instinct misfiring. I've spent 11 years telling myself the same thing. That was me, Alara said quietly. It wasn't a question. Something in her had already known. In the marrow-deep way the body knows truths, the mind refuses to catch up to. That was you, he agreed. Which means whatever happened to your wolf between that day and this one happened after I met you. Someone silenced her deliberately. Alara thought of her father's carefully blank face whenever her lack of shifting was mentioned. She thought of the pack healer's cold hands, the way the woman had never quite met her eyes afterward. She thought of 11 separate autumns spent watching Seraphine's wolf run free through the Vos lands while she stood at her window, aching with a hunger she'd never had a name for. Why would my own father silence me? She asked, and hated how small her voice sounded. Ronan's jaw tightened. Because a bound wolf can't be claimed. A woman without her wolf can't seal a mate bond, can't inherit through blood right, can't threaten anyone's succession. He crouched before her chair, bringing his eyes level with hers, amber meeting hazel. Alara, do you know anything about your mother's line? She died when I was 2. My father never spoke of her family. I always assumed there was nothing worth speaking of. There was everything worth speaking of. Ronan exhaled slowly, and for a moment the fearsome Alpha King looked almost young, almost uncertain. Your mother was Ismenia Dreylock, last acknowledged daughter of the Dreylock line, the first blood pack that held the Aurelian throne 2 centuries before my own family took it in the Wolf Wars. The Dreylock line was declared extinct 40 years ago. If you carry her blood and her bond mark... He nodded at the faint scar on her wrist. Then legally, formally, by every treaty this kingdom still honors. You may have a stronger claim to this throne than I do. The fire popped in the silence that followed. That's impossible, Alara said. My father is a minor lord. We have no money, no standing, no... Your father married into a bloodline he understood far better than he ever let you believe, Ronan said grimly, and bound your wolf the moment he realized what you were. So no one, including you, would ever ask why a penniless lord's daughter set a king's instincts on fire at 11 months old. But why would anyone care about a bloodline that's supposedly extinct? If the Dreylock line ended 40 years ago, whatever claim it carried should have died with it. There'd be nothing left to protect or to threaten. Bloodlines don't work the way treaties do, Ronan said. A treaty can be voided by time. A bloodline can only be voided by the absence of a body to carry it. Legally, the Dreylock claim was never renounced. It was simply declared extinct because everyone believed in good faith that no living heir remained. The moment a living heir is proven, the old claim doesn't need reviving. It was never dead. It was only unclaimed. He crouched again, closer this time, and something in his voice softened even as the words themselves stayed grave. Do you understand what that means for you, Alara? It means every year of your life, you've been told you were the lesser daughter of a failing house, when in fact you may be the last living thread connecting this entire kingdom back to the throne it built its second regime on top of. Alara laughed, short and disbelieving, more reflex than humor. I can't even dress myself without help lacing a corset. I have spent 9 years learning to be quiet and useful, because it was the only role available to me. You're describing a queen. I don't know how to be anyone's queen. Neither did I know how to be a king. The day my father died and left me a crown 3 years earlier than either of us expected, Ronan said. You learn the shape of a thing by carrying it, not by feeling ready for it first. I promise you that. He crossed to the map table and returned with a slim, aged volume, setting it gently in her lap. This belonged to my grandfather. A history of the Wolf Wars, written by someone who lived through them, rather than by a court historian trying to make the outcome sound inevitable afterward. I want you to have it. Not because I expect you to memorize it tonight, but because I think you deserve to understand exactly what you're a descendant of before anyone else in this palace decides what that means on your behalf. Alara opened it carefully, the spine cracking with disuse, and found the pages dense with a cramped, urgent hand describing a conflict that sounded far less like the clean historical narrative she'd half-absorbed growing up, and far more like a tangle of grief and ambition and half-justified violence on every side. It doesn't read like a story where anyone won cleanly, she observed. No war does, once you're close enough to read the handwriting of someone who survived it, Ronan said. The Ashgrave line has held this throne for 2 generations now, built on the ruin of a war neither of us started, but both of us inherited the consequences of. I don't intend to spend my reign pretending my family's claim was simpler or cleaner than it was. And I don't intend to let you spend yours believing the Dreylock claim was some kind of villain's bloodline either, whatever old propaganda Thorne might try to resurrect. Both houses did terrible things and reasonable things in roughly equal measure, the way most houses do when history hands them a war instead of a choice. Alara ran her fingers over the worn page, feeling, for the first time since the ball, something other than fear or disorientation settle into the space where her old certainties used to live. Something closer to curiosity, cautious and new. Thank you, she said quietly, for not simplifying it for me. Everyone else in my life has spent 22 years simplifying things on my behalf. I think I'd rather have the complicated truth. Then you and I will get along extremely well, Ronan said, and for the first time that evening, something in his careful composure cracked into an actual unguarded smile. Alara pressed a hand to her mouth. 22 years of being told she was broken, defective, unwanted, and the truth was the opposite of every cruelty she'd swallowed. She wasn't lesser. She was dangerous to someone, dangerous enough to be silenced in her own crib. Why tell me this now? She asked. Why not simply take me as your mate and let the rest stay buried? Because I don't build things on buried lies, Ronan said, quiet and fierce at once. And because whoever helped your father bind a first-blood heir 11 years ago is still walking free in my court, and I intend to know their name before I put a crown consort ring on your hand. "May I ask you something?" Alara said, before she could think better of it. "That has nothing to do with bloodlines or thrones?" Ronan looked briefly, genuinely surprised, as though the question itself were a rarer gift than anything else exchanged in the room so far. "Please." "What was it like? 11 years carrying a scent you couldn't place? Did you look for me, or did you simply wait?" He was quiet for a moment, turning the question over with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything. "Both, at different times," he admitted. "In the early years, I looked deliberately, traveled to every border negotiation I could justify attending, told myself I was serving the Crown's interests while privately hoping the resonance would strike again. It never did. After a while, I stopped believing it would, and told myself the 17-year-old boy who'd felt it once had simply been mistaken. That instinct, like anything else, could misfire under strange enough circumstances. I built a version of my life around that belief. Courtships I entered without any real hope, because a king is expected to marry regardless of whether the old magic cooperates. I very nearly convinced myself the practical version of a life was the only version available to me. What changed? Nothing for 11 years, he said. And then a woman stood against a wall at my own ball trying to disappear into the marble. And every instinct I had spent a decade convincing myself was unreliable came back all at once, undiminished, exactly as sharp as it had been when I was 17, and didn't yet understand what I was feeling. He held her gaze, steady. "I don't offer you a crown lightly, Alara. I offer it because the alternative, spending another 11 years, or 50, pretending the resonance isn't real, is a kind of dishonesty I no longer have any interest in living inside." Alara said nothing for a long moment, turning his words over the way she imagined he'd turned over her question. "I don't know how to want something this large," she admitted finally. "I've spent so long training myself not to want anything beyond quiet and safety. Wanting a crown, wanting a mate bond, wanting a bloodline I didn't know I carried. It feels like wanting a house with no floor beneath it." "Then we'll build the floor first," Ronan said simply. "There's no rule that says the wanting has to come before the ground is solid. We can do it in whatever order actually holds weight." A knock interrupted them, sharp, urgent. Ronan's beta, a broad-shouldered wolf named Callum Ferris, entered without waiting for permission, his expression tight. Callum had served the Ashgrave crown since Ronan's coronation, a steady, unflappable presence whose calm Alara would come to recognize, in time, as the truest measure of how serious a situation actually was. Callum only allowed his composure to crack when something genuinely threatened the court he'd sworn to protect. "Sire, Lord Vos requests an audience. He's brought Lord Cassian Thorne with him." Callum's eyes flicked to Alara, apologetic, and he inclined his head to her with a courtesy she wasn't used to receiving from anyone outside her own small circle. "My lady, for what it's worth, half the servants' hall is already saying the king did the right thing tonight, whatever the court decides. Word travels fast below stairs, and it isn't always unkind." Alara managed a small, startled nod, unused to being spoken of as anything other than a cautionary tale. "Thorne is already telling half the court that Lady Alara's inability to shift makes her unfit and possibly dangerous, that a wolf who spent 22 years unable to transform could be carrying some kind of corrupted bond, a threat to the pack's magic itself. He's asking for a formal inquiry before any mate claim can proceed." Callum's mouth twisted, distaste plain on his face. "He's moving fast, sire. Faster than a man simply concerned for court propriety usually moves." Alara felt the floor tilt beneath her. "They'll use my own silence against me. The thing that was done to me. They'll call my fault." Ronan's expression went hard as forged iron. "Lord Cassian Thorne has wanted the northern trade routes through Vos lands for 3 years, and been refused twice by treaty law that only applies while the Vos Pack holds independent title," he said slowly, thinking it through even as he spoke it. If Vos's daughter becomes a discredited, disgraced footnote, and the pack falls under formal royal guardianship for harboring dangerous bloodlines, Thorne could petition to administer those lands himself, under the old guardianship statutes. He looked at Alara with something like fierce apology. I think your father isn't only hiding old sins. I think he's still being useful to someone. Alara thought of Seraphine's bright, cruel laughter in the ballroom, and wondered, for the first time in her life, whether her sister had ever been told the truth of any of it, or whether she too had simply been handed a role to perform and never questioned who had written it. The formal inquiry was held 3 days later in the Sunfall Chamber, a circular room ringed with tiered seating where the pack's representatives could watch justice, or its performance, done. Tall windows along the chamber's eastern wall let in the pale gold light of late morning, cutting long bars across the marble floor, and Alara had the strange, dislocated sense of standing inside a sundial, watching time measured out in the space between accusation and answer. The 3 days since the ball had passed in a blur of hushed preparation. Adeline Marsh cloistered in the archive rooms from dawn until midnight, Callum quietly interviewing former Vos household staff, Ronan himself disappearing for hours at a stretch into meetings Alara wasn't yet permitted to attend, all of it building toward this single, exposed hour. Alara stood at the center on a marble dais, flanked by Ronan on one side, and to her surprise by Callum Ferris on the other, a beta's public support lending weight she hadn't expected. She had spent the morning being dressed by a maid who'd never been assigned to her before, in a gown the deep hazel gold of her own eyes, rather than the offering silver of the ball, and she understood without being told that this too was a message, that she was meant to be seen today, not as a candidate for anyone's mate claim, but as a woman standing on her own account. Lord Cassian Thorne spoke first, his voice smooth as poured oil. He was a lean, handsome wolf with silver at his temples and the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once lost a negotiation. I mean no cruelty toward Lady Alara, he began, in the practiced tone of a man about to be exactly that. But this court has laws for a reason. A wolf who cannot shift for 22 years is not merely unlucky. Historical precedent from the Second Regency suggests such prolonged dormancy often indicates a corrupted or incomplete bond, sometimes inherited from unstable bloodlines. I would remind the court that unstable bloodlines have, in the past, produced alphas who could not control their shift at all, with, a pointed pause, violent consequences. Before the king binds himself to an unknown quantity, should we not know precisely what bloodline we are inviting into the succession? A murmur of unease moved through the tiered seats. Somewhere behind Alara, an older lord she didn't recognize made a low sound of agreement, and she felt the weight of it settle over her like a second gown, heavier than the first. 22 years of being called broken had taught her to recognize the particular texture of a room deciding, collectively, what she was. She felt Seraphine, seated with their father in the second row, go very still, and something in her sister's posture, rigid and pale, suggested this argument struck closer to some private fear than Seraphine had expected to feel today. I would add, Thorne continued, warming to the room's uncertain mood, that the crown's haste in this matter concerns me as much as the lady's condition. A king who claims a mate within the very hour of meeting her, based on instinct alone, without the customary courting period our laws provide for precisely this kind of caution, is that not itself a matter for this court's concern? I ask only that we slow down enough to be certain. Surely certainty costs this court nothing but a few weeks' patience. It was, Alara had to admit privately, a clever performance, reasonable in tone, generous in its concern, entirely poisonous in its implication, and calibrated exactly to sound like caution rather than cruelty to every wolf in the tiered seats who hadn't yet decided where their sympathies lay. You raise bloodline concerns with remarkable specificity for a man who claims no personal stake in this matter, Ronan said coolly. Perhaps you'd care to explain your interest in the Vos succession, Lord Thorne, given your standing petition regarding the northern trade routes. A ripple of interest passed through the room. Thorne's composure didn't crack, but it thinned. I speak only as a concerned member of this court. Then you won't object, Ronan said, to my own historian presenting evidence regarding Lady Alara's actual bloodline, rather than speculation about corrupted ones. The court historian, an ancient wolf named Adeline Marsh, who had catalogued Aurelian genealogies for 6 decades, rose with a leather portfolio and began laying out documents, treaty records, a marriage registry from 24 years prior, a portrait miniature so faded it was barely more than a suggestion of a face, but a face with Alara's exact hazel eyes. Ismenia Dreylock, last acknowledged daughter of the first bloodline. For those unfamiliar with the particulars, Adeline said, her dry, precise voice carrying easily across the hushed chamber. The Dreylock pack held the Aurelian throne for nearly 3 centuries before the Wolf Wars, when the current Ashgrave line rose in the chaos of the old regime's collapse. The transition was not entirely bloodless, and for 2 generations afterward, surviving Dreylock heirs were considered, depending on which side of the conflict one asked, either dangerous claimants to a stolen throne or rightful heirs wrongfully displaced. Both views persisted long enough that any surviving Dreylock blood had powerful reasons to stay hidden. I had always assumed, as had every historian before me, that the line ended with Ismenia's death 20 years ago. I was, it appears, incorrect. She held up the marriage registry, her finger tracing a faded line of ink. Ismenia Dreylock married Bastian Vos 24 years ago, in a ceremony recorded under a deliberately abbreviated form of her family name. I. Vos, formerly of Drellin village, an obscuring that would have meant nothing to a casual clerk, but which I recognize, having spent 6 decades in these archives, as a common method used by First Blood survivors to marry without drawing attention to their lineage. Lady Alara was born of that marriage 2 years later. The chamber erupted into noise. Lord Bastian Vos, until now silent and gray-faced in his seat, surged to his feet. "This is irrelevant history," he said, too loudly, too fast. "My wife's lineage has nothing to do with whether the girl is fit to—" "Doesn't it?" Ronan's voice cut through the chamber, like a blade drawn from its sheath. "Because if Alara Vos carries first blood, then a bound wolf isn't a mystery of unstable ancestry, Lord Vos. It's the result of a binding ritual, one that requires a blood relative's hand to perform and a significant working of dark magic to sustain across 2 decades. He turned his full attention on the man. "Someone bound your daughter's wolf in her infancy, Lord Vos. I would very much like to know who." The silence that followed had teeth in it. It was Seraphine who broke it, not their father. She stood slowly, her golden eyes wide, fixed not on Alara but on the man beside her. "Father," she said, and her voice, for once, had none of its ballroom brightness in it. "The healer, the one who used to visit only Alara, only ever at night, only when you sent me and Mother's old maid away first. I was 7. I remember because I asked to come and you told me children weren't permitted near sick rooms." She turned slowly toward Alara, and something in her face cracked open. Not cruelty this time, but a horrified, dawning grief. "You told me she was sick. You told me that so I wouldn't ask more questions. I laughed at her 3 nights ago in front of the entire court because you raised me to believe she was simply lesser. You made that true. You made her that." Lord Vos's composure finally broke. "I did what was necessary to protect this family," he said, and the admission, once loosed, seemed to unmake him where he stood. "Do you have any idea what would have happened if it had been known 20 years ago that a Dreylock heir lived in a minor lord's household? The old regime hunted First Blood survivors for a decade after the Wolf Wars ended. I was protecting her. You were protecting yourself," Ronan said, quiet and merciless. "A hidden First Blood heir is dangerous knowledge. but it is also, held correctly, enormously valuable knowledge, to a man willing to trade it. Isn't it, Lord Thorne? All eyes swung to Cassian Thorne, whose oiled composure had finally, entirely, curdled. Adeline Marsh cleared her throat and produced a second document from her portfolio, a decade-old ledger entry, quietly obtained, detailing a substantial consultation fee paid from Thorne Holdings to the Vos estate, dated the same season the binding healer had last visited. Lord Vos has been receiving a discreet yearly stipend from Thorne Holdings for 11 years, she said. Officially recorded as agricultural consultation, though I have reviewed the Vos estate's actual farming output for the relevant years, and I confess I can find no agricultural improvement whatsoever that would justify payments of this size. I find the timing and the amount equally suggestive. Callum Ferris stepped forward, producing a folded dispatch of his own. Sire, if it please the court, I took the liberty, following our conversation 3 nights ago, of interviewing 2 former Vos household staff members now residing in the capital. Both independently recalled a physician visiting the Vos estate under cover of night on several occasions when Lady Alara was an infant, always arriving and departing by the servant's gate, always paid in coin rather than through any recorded household account. One recalled overhearing Lord Vos instruct the physician that no one, especially not Thorne's men, should know the child was ever unwell, which struck her as an odd thing to say of a man who now claims Lord Thorne as a family friend of many years' standing. The room's murmur had shifted entirely now, the earlier uncertain sympathy for Thorne's reasonable caution, curdling visibly into something colder and more suspicious. You knew, Alara said, staring at her father, the pieces assembling into a shape too ugly to look away from. You didn't just bind me to hide me. You've been paid to keep me hidden, for 11 years. While Thorne waited for the right moment to either marry into my claim or discredit it entirely, whichever served him better. Before the chamber could fully absorb the weight of Callum's dispatch, Alara stepped forward on the dais, a motion small enough that it took a moment for the assembled court to register that the woman at the center of the inquiry intended to speak for herself, rather than remain a subject discussed in the third person by everyone else present. I would like to say something, if the court permits it, she said, and was faintly surprised by how level her own voice came out, given how violently her pulse was hammering. Lord Thorne has spent this morning describing me as a danger, a mystery, a bloodline to be investigated before anyone decides whether I am fit to be claimed. I would like the court to understand that I have spent 22 years being described in exactly that language by people who were never once curious enough to ask me a single question about who I actually was. I was not consulted about my own binding. I was not told the truth about my own mother. I was, until 3 days ago, entirely unaware of what had been done to me, by whom, or why. Whatever this court decides about bloodlines and treaties and old law, I would ask that it also decide, plainly, that a woman is allowed to be more than the thing that was done to her without her consent. She looked briefly at her father, and found she could hold his gaze without flinching for the first time in longer than she could remember. I am not corrupted. I am not dangerous. I am someone who was hidden by people with their own reasons for hiding me. And I would like this court to spend at least as much energy asking why I was hidden as it has spent asking whether I am fit to be found. The chamber was silent for a long moment after she finished. Not the silence of a room deciding what she was, this time, but something closer to the silence of a room recalibrating what it had assumed it already knew. Well said, Adeline murmured, just loud enough for the dais to hear. And beside her, Alara felt Ronan's hand find hers briefly, a small, steadying pressure that asked nothing and offered everything. And tonight, Ronan said, when discrediting you no longer served him, when it looked like a king might claim you anyway, he tried the other approach. Call the bloodline corrupted, call the girl unfit, force a guardianship ruling instead, and take the Vos lands through the back door of a scandal he manufactured himself. One of the seated lords in the upper tier, An older wolf, Alara recognized vaguely as a neutral border magistrate with no particular loyalty to either Vos or Thorne, rose unbidden. "If the court will permit an outside observation," he said, "I have sat through 11 inquiries in my years of service to the Crown, and I have rarely seen an accuser argue so persuasively for the very conspiracy he claims not to be part of." Lord Thorne's specificity regarding bloodline corruption, his convenient timing, and now this financial record together, paint a picture that requires considerably more explanation than concerned member of this court. A ripple of agreement moved through the tiered seats, the room's earlier uncertainty finally tipping decisively away from Thorne. Lord Thorne's mask slipped entirely, and beneath it was something far uglier than polished ambition: cold, calculating panic. "This is a court of law, not a tribunal of whispers," he began. "It is exactly a court of law," Ronan said, "which is why Beta Ferris has already dispatched a formal request to Thorne Holdings for financial disclosure, authorized under my seal 2 hours before this hearing began. I suspected precisely this shape of a conspiracy the moment you raised bloodline concerns with such convenient specificity, Lord Thorne. I simply needed the room to hear it happen." Alara looked at the king beside her. Steady, deliberate, 3 steps ahead of a conspiracy 11 years in the making, and understood for the first time that he had not simply chosen her at a ball. He had spent 3 days building a case strong enough that no court, no father, no scheming lord could ever again call her broken and make it stick. They took Cassian Thorne from the Sunfall chamber under guard before the hour was out, his protests growing thinner with every step, his careful courtly voice finally abandoning its polish entirely as the guard's hands closed on his arms, a small, petty satisfaction Alara allowed herself only a moment to feel before the larger weight of the day settled back over her. Whatever justice the Crown meted out to Thorne would take weeks of formal tribunal to complete, Callum explained quietly. Land disputes and conspiracy charges against a titled lord could not be resolved in a single afternoon, however clear the evidence. But the immediate matter, the binding itself, coiled tight around her ribs like a held breath 22 years long, could not wait for the machinery of justice to finish turning. That reckoning was hers alone, and it was still ahead of her. They moved the ritual to a smaller chamber adjoining the Sunfall room, a bare stone circle used, Adeline explained, for workings too old and too raw for public architecture. No gilt, no tapestries, just worn flagstones scored faintly with the marks of similar rituals performed across centuries. Alara stood at its center while Ronan took up a position just outside the working circle, close enough to reach her, forbidden by the ritual's old rules from crossing the line until it was done. The unbinding ritual could only be performed by blood, Adeline Marsh explained gently, once the chamber had cleared. Lord Vos, stripped now of his land's independent title and facing a formal tribunal of his own for conspiracy and endangerment of a first-blood heir, was brought forward under guard, gray and diminished, a world away from the man who had orchestrated a court scandal only days before. "You will undo what you did," Ronan told him. It was not a request. Lord Bastian Vos looked in that stone circle, like a man finally seeing the true size of what he'd built over 11 years of careful silence. Not the modest protective lie he had told himself each night, but a cage constructed stone by stone around his own daughter's body, maintained at the cost of her entire life's possibility. "I don't know if I remember the exact working," he admitted, voice cracking. "I paid the healer. I didn't perform it myself. I don't know if I even can undo it." "You will find a way," Adeline said, not unkindly, but without any give in it either. The binding required a blood relative's presence and intent to sustain it across 2 decades. That much the old texts are clear on. Your intent held it shut all these years, Lord Vos. Whether or not your own hands ever trace the marks, it stands to reason your intent, turned the other direction, can help open it again. I will guide the working. You will provide what the ritual requires of your blood and your will. That is the whole of what's asked of you today, and it is the very least you owe her. Lord Bastian Vos's hands shook as Adeline guided them through the old working, words in a language older than the wolf wars, low and rhythmic, rising and falling like something half song and half incantation, a working sustained not by malice this time, but by necessity, by a father finally forced to spend on his daughter's freedom the same careful attention he had once spent hiding her. Alara felt it happen from the inside, a cold, tight knot beneath her sternum, wound so long ago she'd mistaken it for the shape of her own body, beginning, slowly, agonizingly, to loosen, like ice giving way along a frozen seam nobody had noticed was there, until the whole surface began to groan. "It will hurt," Adeline warned. 2 decades of binding does not release gently. Brace yourself, child, and do not fight it once it starts. The instinct will be to clench against the pain. Let it move through you instead. It did hurt. It hurt like ice cracking off a frozen river all at once, like a held breath finally let go after minutes rather than seconds, like every autumn she'd watched from her window while Seraphine ran free through the Vos woods, rushing back into her all at once, demanding to be lived. Alara cried out and fell to her knees on the chamber floor, her vision whiting out at the edges, every nerve in her body suddenly, violently aware of a second self she had never once been permitted to meet, a shape coiled beneath her skin for 22 years, patient and starving, and entirely her own. Ronan's control broke the moment she fell. Ritual boundary or not, he crossed the working circle in 2 strides, and caught her before her shoulder struck the flagstones. His voice low and steady in her ear, even as Adeline hissed a warning about interrupting an active binding. "I have you," he said. "Whatever happens next, I have you. Let it happen." Beneath her skin, something ancient and golden-eyed and finally hers surged upward for the first time in her adult memory, and this time nothing held it back. When she rose again, she rose on 4 paws, silver-furred, eyes the same hazel as the faded portrait of Ismenia Dreylock, and the entire chamber went silent in the particular way courts go silent only for wonders. She was smaller than she'd expected, and faster. Every sense suddenly 100 times sharper. The mineral cold of the flagstones under her paws, the wax and lily smell of the hall beyond the door, Ronan's cedar and rain scent now so overwhelming and unmistakably right that some deep animal part of her simply understood, without needing a single word explained, exactly what a mate bond was supposed to feel like. She shifted back slowly, unsteady on legs that had never once carried her in this second shape, and Ronan's arms were there again before she could stumble, wrapping a cloak someone had thought to bring around her shoulders. For a long moment neither of them spoke. There was nothing efficient to say about 22 years finally set right in the space of a few agonizing minutes. It was Seraphine who broke the silence first, having slipped in through the chamber's side door sometime during the ritual, unable, she would say later, to stay away no matter how little right she felt she had to be present. Seraphine crossed the chamber floor and knelt before her sister, tears streaking unchecked down her face. Golden eyes red-rimmed from what looked like hours of crying rather than minutes. "I called you nothing," she said, in front of everyone. "I need you to know I didn't know what I was saying. That doesn't make it right. It just means I was cruel to a truth I never bothered to question. And I don't know how to be sorry enough for that." She pressed her knuckles briefly to her mouth, composing herself. "I've spent 3 days trying to remember every unkind thing I ever said to you, and I can't. There are too many. I stopped counting. I don't expect you to forgive 11 years of it because I've had 1 difficult week to think about it. I only need you to know I'm not going to stop being sorry just because the week ends." Alara shifted back, awkward, new, learning the mechanics of a body that had never done this before, and found herself, for the first time in her life, entirely without the old ache when she looked at her sister. Not because the cruelty hadn't cost her something. It had cost her 22 years. But because she understood now, watching Seraphine's genuine grief, that her sister had been handed the same lie their father sold to the entire court, that Alara was simply lesser, simply broken, and had never once been given reason to look past it until tonight. "You believed what you were raised to believe," Alara said. "That doesn't erase the ballroom. But it also doesn't have to be the only thing that's true between us going forward, if you're willing to actually know me now." Seraphine nodded, wordless, and for the first time in either of their lives, reached for her sister's hand not to correct her posture but simply to hold it. The formal ruling came a week later, once Thorne Holdings' financial disclosures confirmed every ledger Adeline had produced, and once Lord Vos's tribunal concluded with the stripping of his title and a decade of restitution, owed to the Vos Pack he had nearly sold out from under his own daughters. Bastian Vos did not go to the dungeons Alara had half expected. The court's mercy, tempered by Alara's own quiet plea on his behalf, sentenced him instead to a distant northern estate under permanent supervision, stripped of every lever of power he might once have used to harm anyone again, but alive, and, in time, perhaps able to understand what he had actually done. Alara was not certain yet whether she forgave him. She had decided only that she did not need to carry the weight of his punishment alongside the weight of everything else she'd been carrying for 22 years, and that letting the court's mercy stand in place of her own anger felt, for now, like the freer choice. Cassian Thorne lost his petition for the northern trade routes permanently, his lands placed under formal royal oversight for the conspiracy, his title suspended pending full trial. Rumor in the capital held that 2 other lords, emboldened by Thorne's exposure, had come forward within days with their own quiet complaints against him, suggesting his scheming against the Vos Pack had been neither his first nor his only such maneuver. The old guardianship statutes he had tried to weaponize were struck from Aurelian law within the month. No lord, Ronan declared before the full court, would ever again use a fabricated bloodline scandal to seize territory from a family too weak to fight back. It was, Adeline noted dryly, the fastest piece of legal reform the Aurelian court had passed in 40 years, and she suspected future historians would mark the sable ball as the night it became possible. The Vos Pack itself, restored to independent title under Seraphine's name at Alara's own insistence, a gift Seraphine had wept over far longer than dignity strictly allowed, began the long work of rebuilding what 2 conspiracies had nearly hollowed out. Seraphine wrote to Alara every week without fail, small letters full of ordinary pack business and, increasingly, of a sister's voice finding its way back toward something honest after years of performing a role neither of them had chosen. It was not the relationship either of them had grown up believing they'd have. It was, Alara thought, considerably better than the one they'd actually had. The months between the tribunal's close and the formal mate-claiming had passed in a way Alara could only describe, looking back, as a slow and deliberate relearning of her own life. She had spent the first weeks simply adjusting to a body that could shift. Awkward, half-coordinated runs through the palace grounds at dawn with Ronan loping easily beside her, patient through every stumble, laughing only when she laughed first. She had spent evenings with Adeline poring over Dreylock family records, piecing together a lineage and a history that felt, slowly, less like a stranger's inheritance and more like her own. She had written to Seraphine every week in return, watched her sister's letters shift from apology to ordinary news to, eventually, something that read almost like the correspondence of friends rather than the careful diplomacy of estranged siblings finding their way back. She had also, in quieter moments, grieved, for the girl who had spent 9 years believing herself lesser, for the childhood spent watching other wolves run free through the woods while she waited at a window for a change that had been stolen rather than simply delayed. Ronan had not tried to talk her out of that grief when it surfaced, unpredictable, at odd hours. He had only ever sat with her through it, steady as stone, until it passed. One evening, weeks before the formal claiming, she had asked him, half joking to cover the very real fear underneath the question, whether he ever worried he'd chosen wrong, whether the resonance he'd felt across a ballroom might have simply been an old instinct latching onto convenient proof once the Dreylock bloodline came to light, rather than a truth that would have held regardless of what she turned out to carry. Ronan had gone very still at that, in the way she'd learned meant he was taking a question more seriously than his easy exterior usually let on. "I felt it when you were an infant in your mother's arms, Alara, with no crown, no bloodline anyone had yet uncovered, nothing to recommend you to a king's instincts, except whatever you actually were underneath all of it," he said. "The throne came after. The bloodline came after. What I felt first was only ever you. If the Dreylock line had turned out to belong to someone else entirely, and you'd remained a minor lord's disgraced daughter for the rest of your life, I would still have crossed that ballroom for you. I would simply have had a much harder time explaining it to my council." It was not, Alara thought, the kind of reassurance most people got to hear about themselves even once in a lifetime. She had decided, somewhere in the month since, to actually let herself believe it. Alara stood again in Ashgrave Hall on the night of her formal mate claiming, wearing silver, as she had the night everything changed. Except this gown had been made new, fitted to her by hands that knew exactly what they were doing, and this time she did not stand against the wall. Ronan crossed the same stretch of marble floor he had crossed once before, though this time 400 witnesses already knew exactly why, and knelt before her exactly as he had at the sable ball, taking her hand, no longer trembling, in both of his. 11 years I looked for a scent I couldn't name, he said, loud enough for the whole hall to hear it this time. No hush required, no secret left to keep. "I am done looking, Alara Dreylock Vos. I found what I was searching for the moment I walked into a ballroom, and every instinct I owned told me to cross the room for you. Nobody wants you," her sister had laughed once, "in this very hall, in this very spot," the words landing exactly where they'd been aimed to land, precise and cruel, and, for one terrible evening, indistinguishable from the truth. Alara had turned that sentence over more times than she could count in the month since. In the quiet hours after a shift practice left her aching in muscles she'd never used before. In the long nights spent reading Dreylock family records with Adeline until her eyes blurred. In the careful, halting letters she and Seraphine had exchanged as they relearned how to be sisters, rather than a cautionary tale in its audience. She had expected, somewhere in that process, to want revenge on the sentence itself, to imagine some triumphant reckoning where she proved her sister wrong in the most humiliating way available. Instead, what she felt now, standing in the same hall in a new gown, with a king kneeling in front of her by choice rather than pity, was something quieter and stranger than triumph. Not vindication, something closer to relief. The specific relief of finally setting down a weight she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying since she was 13 years old, waiting on a porch step for a wolf that had, in fact, been waiting on her the entire time. Alara looked down at the king kneeling before her, at the silver scar on her wrist that had once been a cage and was now only a story she got to keep, and thought that some cruelties, spoken loudly enough into the wrong room, had a way of traveling all the way back around to become their own undoing. "Ask me again," she said softly, "what nobody wants." And the Alpha King of the Aurelian court, in front of the whole assembled might of his court, laughed, warm, unguarded, entirely undone, and kissed her hand instead of answering, because some questions only needed a room full of witnesses to already know the truth.